Hi Percy, hi Hadrian, this is Nana Lynn. And for those of you who may be watching this video who are not my grandsons, this is Lynn Serafinn. I'm speaking from Bedford, England today. Today is the 31st of October, which is Halloween in many countries, 31st of October 2019. And the reason why I'm making this video today is it is the 100th birthday of my late father, and I wanted to tell his story over this next year. Actually it's his, I guess we're entering his 101st year, but he's completed 100 years. But I want to tell his story for my family. I could write it down, but I wanted to tell it in my own words as well. And if I told his whole story, it would take weeks. So I'm going to actually just today, I want to tell a short story about when he was very little, or at least a description of where he came from and where he ended up by around the age of 3, because I think that's of real importance. There are a lot of reasons why I'm doing this today. One is because obviously it's his 100th anniversary. Another is because I feel that kids don't really understand anything about their grandparents or great-grandparents unless somebody tells them. They don't. It's not that they don't understand, they don't know. And also they may not understand the details of that person's personality or what they went through unless they're actually told. And I feel that's a horrible thing for that kind of stuff to be lost, because when we know our grandparents, great-grandparents, and other ancestors, we feel more aware of how we got to be we feel a greater sense of love for them and a greater sense of understanding. So today I want to do that for that reason. And the other reason in particular, well, is two. I know that this is right around the time of the Day of the Dead. It always is every year. And I know that your mom, Percy and Hadrian, I know that your mom has just made a little shrine to the deceased grandparents in memory of the Day of the Dead. And I know that just earlier this month you lost your very, very much loved great-grandfather Martin, who was a lovely, lovely man. And I know everybody in the family is going to miss him. So I don't know about Martin's life. So I'm going to talk about my dad's life, who was also your great-grandfather. Okay, so my dad was your mom's grandfather and your great-grandfather. And again, I'm speaking mainly to Percy today because you're 13 years old as I'm making this, but I'm also speaking to Hadrian, who is only 2.5, and later, when he gets a little bigger, hopefully he'll listen to this. Anyway, so my dad's name, when he was born, was very unusual for English speakers. His name was Romeo Fedele Serafini. Romeo Fedele Serafini. Fedele was actually the name of his grandfather, so his father's father. And so he was somewhat called after his father's father, but they also called him Romeo because I think my grandmother probably wanted something a bit more unusual. And of course, he was born on October 31st, 1919, 100 years ago today. Where was he born? Okay, well, he was born in a very little village called Duvredo in a part of what is now northern Italy, in Trentino, the province of Trentino in northern Italy. And when I ever asked my father where he came from when I was little, he used to say, oh, near Trento, because Trento is a city. And I think you know I go there quite a lot. And he would just say, near Trento, near Trento. And I said, well, where near Trento? Where did you come from? And he said, well, it's so small. It is so small. It's not even on a map. That's what he used to say. Now, mind you, that's before Google Maps. So, you know, maybe you couldn't find it on a map back then, but you can now. It's on the map. And you could also take a Google tour, in fact, of Duvredo. But let me give you an idea of how small it is. Try to imagine your town in Stevenage. You live in Stevenage in Hertfordshire here in England. Try to imagine where you live. Try to imagine the street where you live, just your street, okay? Try to imagine all the houses on your street separate, so they're not attached to each other like they are in Stevenage, all separate and spread out over, I don't know, a few blocks that you did that, and then plop a tiny little church in the middle of them that is probably no bigger than your living room, maybe taller, but not much bigger. I mean tiny, tiny, tiny little church. And that's the village. That's the village. So it's like the size of your street, but stretched out with fields and places where people grow food. But the houses are stretched out. The houses are much taller. The houses are actually 4 stories high. Let me describe the houses. On the lower level, in the old days, that's where they used to keep the animals. The cows, the pigs, the sheep, the chickens. Well, maybe not the chickens. I think they stayed outside. But the bigger animals were underneath the house. Then the ground level, that's where people lived. Okay, that's where the families spent their time. The level above that is, I have to think now. I think that's, oh gosh, one of them is where they kept like wood and stuff like that they used all the time. And then the level above is where they used to keep the food, the grain, and stuff like that that needed storage. Now, these were big houses, big tall houses, and extended families used to live in these houses. And the house that my dad was born in, part of it, the oldest part of it, is probably 500 years old, 400 or 500 years old. Old, okay, very old. But it doesn't look it because it's been remodeled and taken care of. Anyway, that's where he was born. Now, when he was born, the country was going through a lot of stuff, and I'm not actually going to talk about that because I'll talk about that in another video when I talk about his father and his parents. But for several reasons that I won't explain, they decided to leave to go to America. Oh, but wait, I want to give you, before we talk about that, before you can really understand how hard that must have been, I want to talk about more about what his life was probably like. Now, he was a very little boy when he left. He was only about your brother's age, about Hadrian's age, 2.5, almost 3, somewhere in there. I'd have to calculate it. He was just not quite 3, a few months shy of 3 years old. Anyway, so try to imagine little boy like Hadrian, very conscious, probably very playful, probably very talkative because he was, probably joked around a lot. And so he's in this village. Everybody knows everybody. Probably everybody is related to everybody in some form. Cousins here, cousins there, cousins over there. There are no cars. I mean, cars were invented, but nobody there owned a car. They may have had horses and carts, but not cars. So the streets were safe. All the kids are running out in the streets and playing. Also, all the houses are surrounded by fields and rolling hills and mountains around the whole area because they lived in a valley. And so the mountains surrounded the whole village, the whole parish. Something about when I use the word parish. Parish, actually, it refers to the church area, but in this case, I'm talking about a bigger area. So I talked about his little village. Try to imagine over here, there's another little village and another one and another one and another one. And they're all kind of little pockets of little tiny villages. We call them frazioni. Little tiny frazioni. And when you add them all together, we call them a parish, or you can call it a comune in modern, but I usually refer to the parish. Anyway, so his mom didn't come from the village where he was born. His mom came from a village over there, probably about 15, 20 minutes to walk away. His mom came from a village called Bono. His dad came from the village of Duvredo. So his mom, Maria, moved over here when she got married. So they probably knew each other before they got married, certainly. But she didn't come from the same little tiny village. But everybody really knew each other. Fields full of apples, corn. What else is there? Mainly apples and corn. That's what they grow a lot in that area. There's a lot of other things as well. Nuts, lots of nut trees, and lots of animals. And on the fields, you'd see the cows grazing, the sheep grazing. And up higher in the hills, there will be places where they take the cows to make the cheese and the milk, and put all the milk together, make all the milk products, because cheese was very, very important in their diet. So this is how they lived. They all knew each other. It was rolling hills. There was so much freedom. The air is brilliantly clean. No traffic. No airplanes flying overhead. Clean air. There were rivers nearby. Right outside their house, there was a spring that's still there. And that's the well where they used to get their water. I'm sure they had running water in their house by then, but the spring is what actually fed the whole village and gave them all the water. And this spring, this water in these villages, when you get this spring water, it comes from the glaciers. So glaciers are in the mountains, big icy things in the mountains that melt. And as they melt, they create rivers. And also they create underground streams. And these streams are these springs rather, are very, very cold and fresh. So you get this incredible, cold, fresh, clean, wonderful tasting water out of the springs. So imagine that. And there's one more thing about Duvredo that is particularly interesting. Right at the end of his garden, right at the end of my father's garden, if you run to the end, you will see a hill dropping down and then another hill going up. And on top of that hill is this amazing castle. It's a ruined castle, but it's not like the one here in Bedford where it's just a hill and a few rocks. This is a proper castle ruin. It's not huge like some that you may have seen in England, but it's really spooky. You can just walk up there and it feels haunted. It was ruined quite some time ago, but it has a lot of history. But imagine being a little boy running around in the fields, lots of cows and sheep and all these cousins and wonderful air and spring water and a haunted castle on a hill. And then one day, you have to leave all of that. All your grandparents, all your great-grandparents, actually one or two of his grandparents were still alive, like yours, same as you. He had to leave all of that with his parents. Well, his father went first to kind of set things up. I'll tell you more about that another day. That's not today's story. And then later, when his father said, okay, I got things set up now, you can come. His mother, his older sister, and his younger sister. His older sister's name was Ligina. Younger sister's name was Pierina. So the three children, and Pierina was quite little. She was only like a year and a half, if that much. So the three children, my grandmother, and my grandmother's sister. I think the brother came later, but her sister, whose name was Rustica, but I knew her as Lina. She hated that name Rustica. She thought it was ugly, so she called herself Lina. Okay, go figure. Anyway, so her name was Rustica, and on records it says Rustica. So they, 2 women, 3 kids. Try to imagine, and young women, like in their 20s, younger than your parents. Okay, they now have to go on their own to Geneva, which I think you drove through once. It's on the top of Italy, but in the west. It's a sea town, not that close. They probably took a train maybe a carriage part of the way, and a train part of the way, and then another carriage part of the way. It was probably a long enough journey to get from Duvredo. They probably had to go to Trento first, and then over here, and then over here, and then they went over to Genova. Why did they go to Genova? Well, Genova was on the ocean, or the sea, and that was where the ships were to go across the Atlantic to go to America, which is where they were headed. Now, fortunately, by this time, those ships were run by steam, and they only took 10 or 12 days to cross the ocean. But still, 10 or 12 days. If it weren't steam, it would have taken weeks, I think. I can't remember, or maybe months. It was a long time and much more dangerous. But at least by this time, they had steam ships that crossed the ocean in about 10 or 12 days, depending on the weather. Always depending on the weather. It's not like going on a train or a plane where you pretty much end up roughly at the time you expect. It had to depend on the sea and the weather. So they went across the ocean, but they weren't in luxury class. They had to go in the poor area. Some people call it steerage, which was down at the bottom of the ship. Maybe you saw, no, I don't think you've seen, I won't mention it. I was going to mention another film, but I'm not going to mention it. It was down at the bottom of the ship, very crowded, probably not very comfortable. No idea how they had to sleep, but probably quite next to each other. No idea how they used the toilet, no idea what they ate, or if they were fed, or they had to bring their own food. I don't know. But it wasn't very comfortable. I think they used to let them come up on the deck to get some fresh air, but still, they were not like top-class passengers. It wasn't comfortable. So try to imagine everybody cramped in at the bottom of a ship, dark, no windows, right on top of each other for 10 or 12 days. Try to imagine that. Not comfortable. And try to imagine also not just what it does to your head, makes you crazy, makes you go, I want to leave. Not just what it does to your head, but also people get sick. And not just because the sea is bumping up and down. They can get sick because they're living right on top of each other. Now, that happened to not my dad, but his older sister, Regina, who was about 3.5, 4 years older than he was, almost 4 years older. And so she was about 7. I don't know what she got sick from, but I suspect it was something to do with being right on top of other people all the time. And she was so sick that when they finally arrived in New York, she had to go to the hospital. So she was hospitalized and quarantined, which means kept away from everybody else for several days. Maybe I can't remember how long, or I'm not sure if I know how long, but it was long enough that it was written in the documents, and they were called detained. Now, sometimes in those days, if somebody was sick, the Americans in Ellis Island, which is the place where they went, sometimes they'd send them back if they thought they were too sick and that they would spread their sickness to other people. Fortunately, that didn't happen. But what did happen is that my grandmother and my aunt, my father's sister, were over there in the hospital, and my father, with his little baby sister, was left on his own with his aunt, with Rustica, who calls herself Lena. In fact, my father, when I asked him, what do you remember about Ellis Island? Because he was quite little, I said, do you remember anything? He says, yes, I remember my Aunt Lena. Zia is the word we say for aunt. I know you're learning Italian. Zia. Zia means aunt. So he remembers Zia Lena, Zia Rustica, Zia Lena. He remembers her. He doesn't remember anything else. He just remembers being with her, and she would make food for him and take care of him. So she was very close to him. And what is interesting is that their whole lives, They were very close. I'll talk about them another time, and Lena another time. But this started, I think, at Ellis Island, and they were very, very close until she passed away. And I knew her very well. She was a very, very sweet lady. But anyway, that's his actual memory. That's his actual memory. Now, I don't know what happened, how they got to, I know where they were going after that. They were going to Brandy Camp, Pennsylvania, which was a place where they were coal miners. My grandfather was a coal miner. Not the subject of today's video. That's for another day. And I don't actually know what happened in the journey from Ellis Island going to Pennsylvania. But I was told a story by my father's cousin, who is also almost 100 years old. His name is Aldo Serafini. He's still alive and living in New Jersey. So he's my father's cousin. He was the child of my grandfather's brother. So he knew my dad when they were little. And he also came over when he was a child, but he was actually older. He was like 7 or 8. And his father was already over there too. He said that when they came over on the boat to wherever they were landing, they saw the father there waving. I can't remember the exact details of how, but when they saw it, he said his mother just broke down in tears. She was really, really emotional because here she was, also with 3 children, coming across the ocean by herself to a place unknown. They don't know the language. They don't know what's going to happen. It's culturally very, very, very different. They left all their beloved parents, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, grandparents, great-grandparents, and history back there. And she cried with joy and relief to see her husband, but imagine all the other emotions that were going on. At the end of this video, I'm going to show you a picture of my dad when he was, shortly after he arrived in America. It's the youngest picture I have of him. When I look at his little face and also the faces of his 2 sisters, I'll confess, I feel like crying. Maybe you'll feel the same. Maybe not today, maybe sometime in the future. Anyway, I just wanted to tell you something about what it might have been like for a little boy, your brother's age, to leave his home, even though he's with his mother and siblings, to leave his home, this wonderful, free, lovely place, and get stuck in the bottom of a ship, land in Ellis Island, be separated from his mother, and then go off to someplace where he has no idea what's going to happen next. And with that, I think that's a good point to stop the story for today. And I think my intention today was to get you to think about your great-grandfather as a little boy, as someone small, and what that must have felt like to move to another country. I hope this makes you feel something, and I hope it gave you some information that you found fun and interesting. And on this day, let's honor Romeo, who was called Ralph in the United States, Ralph Serafinn, and Martin, and my mom, and Wendy, and all your other great-grandparents who are no longer here. Okay, so take care, and love you.